Hello and welcome to today's Partner Web Conference. This is Fast Track Dynamics 365 for Finance and Operations Enterprise Edition Tech Talk. Today's topic, Task Automation Framework for Data Management. Presenting for us today from Microsoft, we have Senior R&D Solution Architect, Sunil Garg. So without any further delay, Sunil, the floor is all yours.
Good afternoon and good evening, everyone. This is Sunil Garg. So today we are going to take a look at some of the new capabilities that we are building in data management, which is around automation of most frequently used tasks in the space of data management. So before we dive into the session and the demos, a quick look at some of the objectives as to why we started to work on this and how we see this being used by all of us as we go through the implementations in our projects. The first set of scenarios that we were looking at is to basically help in making it easy for implementation teams when it comes to, say, creation of data projects, right? Now, we have heard a lot of feedback from all of you and our field in general around lack of tools when it comes to managing configurations for data projects, managing configurations for recurring schedules, where teams have to go and create these data projects and recurring schedules on every environment as they go through the implementation phase. Now, for large projects, it is very typical to see 50 to 100 data projects that teams end up creating. And if they don't have, or if they have not found creative ways to automate that, they end up doing that manually. So there is a lot of time that teams spend in trying to do that. And also, today we don't have a good story around ALM for managing such configurations as well. So this was a scenario we wanted to address as we work through this task automation, and we will take a look at how this actually unfolds in a quick demo towards the end of the session. The next set of scenarios is around basically importing data packages into data management without having to manually create the data project, without having to manually dealing with the data packages and the data files that needs to be imported, right? Now, LCS, there is an option in LCS where somebody can go and deploy the data package from LCS also. Now, this is an alternate solution, a second option, if you will, for implementation teams to explore and see how this option can be useful in addition to what we already have from the LCS side. So things like demo data setup. So once the environment is deployed, then if the environment needs some test data, then typically teams go and import the demo data packages. So we'll see how this option kind of streamlines that process. And along the same lines, it can be any data package, right? It doesn't have to be demo data package. It could be the golden configuration data packages that needs to be applied as base configurations on a brand new system that was just deployed. And also, when it comes to data migration, and I'll talk a little bit more detail about data migration scenarios as we go through the presentation. But basically, identify tasks from the data migration plan that can be automated using these new capabilities as it is applicable. The next set of requirements and objectives was, around the test automation of data entities itself and integration scenarios, right? Now, we are going through, we know the challenges that, teams go through because we go through the same pains. And, we recognize that, even the implementation teams, the partner teams that is working on extensions and working with data entities also should be going through similar pains when it comes to validation of data entity functionality and validation of integration functionalities, right? Now, sure, teams go through testing these scenarios manually, but if there is a way for us to help with automation of such scenarios, then it should definitely help in the overall process, and it should definitely help in the overall turnaround time when it comes to validations of data entity specific scenarios through implementation. So we'll take a look at how the task automation can be also used for automated testing and how that plays out. So we'll take a look at that as well. So these were some of the core objectives we had in mind when we started to work on this specific framework. Now I'll dive a little bit into the test automation objective. And to put things in context, when it comes to data management scenarios, there are different buckets of configuration, if you will, that somebody has to do. And if we put all these configuration into a permutation and combination matrix, then all of a sudden the scenario matrix just explodes. And if we multiply that with the number of data entities that somebody has to test based on the functional footprint for the implementation project, then the number of test cases, if you will, somebody can identify becomes quite staggering. So to put things in context, the challenges around why it becomes so difficult to test and manage is basically around the behaviors that somebody can go and configure in data management. Now, this is all flexibility that the data management platform framework provides, but at the same time, this also provides challenges in terms of validations, right? So we start with the entity behavior. There are a bunch of file formats that are supported out of the box, and every file format ideally needs to be tested, at least based on what the implementation teams wants to use. And going forward, there are other entity behaviors, like, for example, change tracking. So does change tracking work for your entities? That should be tested under different permutation and combination again. And does the entity behave well if you want to push the data to your bring your own database flows? Does the entity behave well, again, full push versus incremental push in the context of change tracking? And also the concept of having one Excel file which can have several worksheets, and you can have one entity map to a specific worksheet. If somebody wants to bring such worksheets through for import, for example, does it work? Does it work from recurring integrations? Does it work from the UI? Right. So if teams are looking to use a specific functionality, then they should be able to validate that this works in all the permutation and combination of scenarios. And going forward on the entity behavior itself, there are a few other settings that somebody can configure. I'll call out the parallel processing settings, and I'll also call out the entity mapping settings that somebody can do on the mapping itself. Should the value for a column default, or should the value for the column be auto-generated using number sequence? Now, these become quite significant in the context of data migration, right? So teams can go and configure these detailed rules, but when somebody is migrating thousands and thousands, and even sometimes millions of records as part of migration, then the task of validating did the data come in correctly is a huge task. Right? Teams spend weeks, depending on the size of the data migration, just to validate the data. Now, our goal as we go through this journey is to help ease that pain as well, where we are looking at ways in which the data can be validated right out of the task automation manager itself. Just to give a quick idea on the quality of data that has come in. By no means this should not be a replacement for all the testing and validation that the teams do, but the hope is a quick validation whether the data looks good or not can go a long way in terms of helping save time for implementation teams. Last but not the least, on the entity side are the entity filters. So we should be able to define filters on entity, which we can today, but we should also be able to validate as part of the normal QA process for implementation teams in an automated fashion, of course. Then moving forward are the entity types, right? So as we all know, there are simple entities, composite entities, and set-based entities. So again, depending on what Microsoft ships and depending on what the implementations team starts building on their own, they should be able to leverage this automation capability to test all around for whatever entities that the team is building. The entity data also plays a good role in the final outcome of import-export process, right? Simple data versus self-referential data behave differently. So it is absolutely important for teams and including us at Microsoft before we ship something to make sure that entities behave well with different kinds of data. So these were the challenges that we are going through, and we are recognizing that this should be a challenge for our partner teams as well, and hence this framework should certainly help. Going forward, the entity behavior was one aspect of it. The other big aspect is data projects. So data projects also has their own or its own parameters and switches that somebody can turn on, turn off to change the behavior depending on the requirements. So this again, put in context, creates its own flavors and hence challenges around how can somebody make sure that a entity that somebody has developed will work across the board. There are other conditions also. Again, from a testing perspective, reliability is a big piece on top of functional and performance, right? Can a specific operation be performed 1,000 times? Will it still continue to work? Can we push 1,000 messages per minute or per hour to the integration endpoint? And how will the system behave? These are aspects that is interesting for us from a Microsoft perspective, but this tooling will be available to everyone, right? So depending on how complicated your customers' projects are, now you will have these tools in place for the implementation teams to also validate exactly the way we will be validating or we are validating using an automated fashion, not just manual fashion. Again, cloud versus on-premise, that is also a pretty significant parameter, right? So right now, the framework is supported for cloud. We are going through the validation for on-prem, but it will take some time for us to make sure that this automation is fully functional for on-prem. But that is absolutely the goal, that the same framework should be possible, should be available to perform automation of general tasks and also for automated testing in on-prem as well. And then finally, the other most important aspect of any automated testing or any automation is validations. So it is great that we are able to define automated tests very quickly, as we will see, but also the other challenging aspect in data management in particular is to make sure that whatever was performed, whether it is import or export, it actually succeeded, right? Now, there are different points of failure all along the way, and hence, it becomes quite challenging to make sure that everything has passed for a specific scenario. I'll call out the data corruption aspect of validation, right? And this is quite central from a data migration perspective also, which I talked about, which is, did everything come in as expected, right? Now, this is a very simple question to ask, but then once we start to answer this question, we run into all sorts of challenges and complexities, simply because there are so many options that somebody could go and configure because of the flexibility the framework provides, that it becomes quite challenging to make sure that we are able to validate if the data came in correctly or not. So this is an area that we have not started to work yet, simply because it has been a challenge for us to figure out a consistent pattern that can be automated from a validation perspective. So we'll certainly welcome feedback from all of you as you start playing with this functionality. Your feedback is always welcome in terms of how we can make this happen. And last but not the least, when I say specific settings, what we mean by that is based on what settings were done out of this 50 plus settings that is there on the slide. For example, if truncation was enabled, we need to make sure and validate that truncation actually worked, right? So that's what we mean by specific settings. Based on what was set up, the automation framework is aware of those settings, and it will go and validate by itself, did that setting take place or take effect or not. So that is kind of the context for laying the landscape around why it is challenging for validation of data entities and integration scenarios from data management perspective, and how the automation framework can be handy to help in this objective. Moving forward, my slide has stuck. Give me a moment. So from a framework design summary, these are the high-level principles and guidelines that we have and we want to follow from this framework perspective. The first one is built into the product, right? So this is not something that somebody has to download as a separate tool, or it is a GitHub app. It is basically built into data management itself, which makes it available for everyone and which makes it available on every environment. So you can use this on a single box dev machine or in any tier 2, tier 3, or any environment, including production environment. Now we'll talk about do's and don'ts on the production environment, but in general, this is available for everyone and anyone who has access to data management. So that was one of the core principles, if you will, and that is what we have been sticking to. The next one is low code, no code, meaning it should be possible even for a functional consultant to go and define a task that needs to be automated without writing a line of code. So that increases the usability of the framework itself, and that makes it very agile from a usability perspective. And we'll take a look at how that unfolds and what we mean by declarative authoring of tasks. The next piece is, the handling of data itself, whether it is a data package or data file, but most likely data package is what we all use. The handling of that data package in the context of automation should be very seamless, right? We should not be passing around data packages and within the team members for automation purposes. So basically the approach this has taken is, it is integrated with LCS. So, you can declaratively define for a task as to which is the LCS project that the data package needs to be pulled from, or if it is a shared asset library, then you can do that also. So this enables scenarios where a central team can manage, or a group of functional consultants can manage the data aspect of it and define the tasks or the tests depending on what is the objective. And then the rest of the team can just start using it. Even if the team is spread across globally, it shouldn't matter because the data is centrally located and the teams can just start using it without having to worry about which golden configuration package to use or which data migration package to use. It's all there in one place. The next one, when we say AOT resources, is purely from a dev ALM perspective. So if we take a look at the configuration of data project as a scenario, then very soon one realizes that it will be really nice if the configuration management of data projects and recurring schedules was integrated with the dev ALM itself, the overall ALM itself. And that is where what we mean by AOT resources is the manifest that somebody will write for these tasks to be automated. The XML file can just be checked into the source control, right? It can be a resource in AOT. And the task automation manager, once it is deployed to an environment, it can read the resources of specific kind from the AOT itself, from the resources itself. This makes the end-to-end process very seamless, where there is no passing around of manifest, if you will. It's all locked through the ALM process itself. And this also opens up the doors for us at Microsoft to share key test cases with all of you which you can take it and you can run before you jump onto a certain platform, or before you if you want to quickly assess the quality of data management itself. So that's the goal that we are working towards. The next one is supports loading of manifest from file system as well. So sure, I mean, if you want a quick run of a test, then you can, or a task, you can just load it from the file system also. Last but not the least, again, we talked about validations, but building rich validations is a core framework, because the ultimate value proposition, the ultimate success for any task automation is to give the confidence that yes, it passed, but here are the reasons why it passed, or it failed, and here are the reasons why it failed. The more rich validations we are able to build into this, the more value implementation teams can derive out of the framework itself. Now let's take a look at the low-code, no-code concept and how does the manifest look like. So at a high level, the XML manifest has two big groups. One is the shared setup group. The shared setup is where all the requirements around what data to use, what is the job configuration or the data project configuration, and what is the entity configuration that needs to be applied for a specific task or a specific test is defined in the shared setup itself. Then comes the test group. This is where all the tasks are defined, and we'll take a look at how that specific element looks like. Now, if we expand the shared setup, so this is where the data is defined. Now, if you look at the data definition itself, it takes the asset type and the asset name, and most importantly, it takes a LCS project as an attribute. The LCS project ID can be blank, and if it is blank, it means it is the shared asset library. And if it has a specific project ID, then the framework knows to go and grab the specific data package from that project's asset library. So this way, one can manage the data aspect centrally, and as long as the user running the automation has access to the LCS project, they should be able to just run without having to worry about where the data is coming from. The next piece somebody will define is the job definition, and this is how the definition of a data project would look like. And this basically has all the parameters that is today possible to be configured on the data project. So as we add new capabilities to the data management itself, the automation needs to be in sync. So you will see this list of elements, expanding or shrinking also, depending on what the data management features do. So, for example, one can define what the operation should be, whether it is an import project that somebody wants to create or a export project. Skip staging versus truncation. And then the next important element here is the mode. So should the import be should be done as a async import, like somebody would do from the UI, just clicking the import button, or should this be done through the recurring APIs using the NQ API, for example? So that can be specified, what mode the operation has to be performed in. Now, from a recurring import or recurring export perspective, this is something that we would not encourage to run on production, because the intent for having this capability is not to implement integration scenarios using this, but this is purely to have a quick way to validate that all your plumbing is in place, and you can quickly do a test to make sure that yes, integrations are working and everything else underneath it is working. So this is a quick way to validate the infrastructure setup, to validate all your integration points are all configured correctly. This is by no way should be used to implement production integration scenarios as such. And this will be called out in the wiki as well as we roll out this functionality in PU16. But something to keep in mind on that front. Similarly, you can configure a task to be configuration only. And this is where the configuration management comes into play, where you can say, hey, go and create this data project, go and configure the recurring schedule, And this is a configuration only task, meaning do not go and start the operation, just create the project and come back. So this element comes quite handy to enable those kind of scenarios. Then you have the flexibility to define the batch aspect if it is a recurring type of a operation. So you can define all the batch related parameters, what is the frequency, the number of times, and what is the frequency to send messages to the endpoint. So this is where the reliability testing comes into play, where somebody can go and configure this to say that, hey, send 10 files every second, or 10 or send one file every 30 seconds, whatever that frequency is. It can be just dialed up or dialed down, and that way it gives quite a powerful tool at hand to quickly go and test these scenarios in a quick automated fashion. So I will not go through all the elements here, but basically that gives an idea as to how the data project setup will be done. So the next piece is the entity setup itself. On similar lines that we have seen so far, all the entity behavior is also defined as elements here. What format, whether change tracking should be set to yes or no. Should this be published to your bring your own database if you have those scenarios? All the other aspects of the entity behavior can be defined here, including the parallel processing settings, right? Now, the other key piece I want to call out here is, typically when we use data packages, there are, of course, there are more than one entities, but in general, when we deal with demo data packages or even bigger implementations, they may have, hundreds of entities. At least the demo data packages that we ship, they go all the way to, 400 plus entities in the same data package. So, it will be quite flexible to have a concept of a wildcard on the entity setup, where we say that this specific settings applies to all entities in the data package without having to explicitly go and define one at a time. So that is where the star in the entity name comes into play, where this is a wildcard and apply all the settings to all the entities in the package. But at the same time, if you give a name, like entity name equals, say, currencies, and then define certain behaviors, then the framework is smart enough to understand that for currency entity, I'm going to apply these specific settings. And for the rest of the 500 entities in the package, I will just apply the generic settings, which is indicated by the wildcard. So all of a sudden, this gives a good flexibility to quickly enable so many scenarios in a very short time using the same data package, without having to break it up into individual files and whatnot. So on the right-hand side screen, if you can see, there is the concept of mapping detail. So that is where you can go and define entity-specific mapping details as to should that specific column in that entity be auto-generated or auto-defaulted, and so on and so forth. Now, building validations for those is quite challenging, and that is what I was mentioning earlier, that we haven't really started on the data validation side of it because of these challenges, and because of the fact that the input format can be in several different formats, Excel versus CSV versus you name it, and it is quite possible there. So trying to come up with a canonical form that can take into account all the formats, that can take into account all the business logic here, and also the business logic that can be there in extensions as implementation teams extend the entities, right? So those are the challenges that we are trying to figure out. How can we account for all of this and still be able to provide a very reliable validation capabilities? So the final section in the manifest is the task itself. So after having defined all the setup information for the data, for the project, and for the entities, it's time for us to define those unique tasks that can use those setup, that can inherit those setup, and then also override at the task level to create a unique task behavior, right? So this is a sample task here where I just have a task here that will import the shared setup demo data package. Now, if you notice here, the job definition is actually overriding the mode in which the input has to happen. In the shared setup, the common setup, it has recurring batch, because if the expectation is, most of the tasks in the manifest will use the recurring batch, then have that in the shared setup. But this specific task wants to use, import async, basically somebody clicking the import button in the UI, right? So if for addressing such requirements, the task can override specific element at the task level, and that opens up a lot of flexibility in terms of how one can leverage the shared setup, thereby not bloating the manifest and keeping the manifest in a very manageable form and still be able to get all the flexibility. Now, there are some attributes here I wanted to talk about. For example, the repeat count. The repeat count is not implemented yet, but the idea and the objective is to enable repeatable scenarios. For example, if somebody wants to execute a task 10 times, then they should be able to perform that by just setting the repeat count as 10, and the framework will just do that 10 times. Now, it can be used for configuration purposes. It can definitely be quite handy from a reliability testing perspective. The next attribute here is trace parser. Again, this is not yet implemented, but just to share the vision and just to share the objective, we would like to have the trace parser also integrated as part of the automation framework, so that if some certain tasks have taken time, now this is in the context of, say, testing itself, right? So let's say you have deployed your UAT and you are running a bunch of automated tests using this framework. And if trace parsing capability was inbuilt, then you can just enable or disable based on a certain task. If you are importing vendor entity or customer entity, then you definitely want to make sure you have the traces captured at that time, because if you see some performance issues, then the traces are there, right there. You don't have to run the test again to figure out, okay, let me enable tracing now and then let me run the scenario. So the idea is to make it as easy as possible, and also use this to have a QA bar defined for every implementation projects to make sure that before somebody goes into UAT or before somebody goes into production, they have gone through this process to validate and to vet out the entity-related scenarios. And then the timeout is quite obvious, which is you can define a maximum time the framework has to wait for a task to get completed, because of various reasons the task may take more than expected time, and that clearly indicates a problem. But at the same time, we don't want the rest of the task to be just waiting just because the previous task has never completed. So, one can define a timeout, and the framework will just, time out for that task and continue with the next task. So now we can quickly jump to see the demo. Let me quickly share. So this is the D365 FO environment, and let me quickly show here. So this is a brand new environment, doesn't have any data in it, and this is typically, implementation teams will start when they deploy an environment, and which is why I'm choosing the same, flow. So this is the new task automation here. If I open it, we see the task automation manager, and these are the different options for related to the manifest itself. So one can load the manifest from the file system, as we talked about, and I have these different manifests created here just to share the vision, just to share the concept behind a manifest, right? Once you start playing with this, there will be questions around, what should constitute a manifest, how many manifests one should have, what are the best practices to define the manifest, right? So examples here are, if we look at data configuration, then, I have a separate manifest for data configuration itself. And this manifest can be checked into source control, and this becomes my ALM story. Right? This is a configuration management process that we can enable. We are enabling here. And from a testability perspective, teams can choose to have check-in tests, regression tests, reliability tests, and so on and so forth. Right? So these are different manifests. And if teams want, they can have a demo data setup manifest also that defines which packages should be set up. And it can have a golden configuration data package inside it, referencing for the tasks to be used. So this way you can see, quickly, how teams can certainly have more than one manifest, and how the manifest, since it's just an XML file, you can subject it to source control, and it can just flow through your ALM process as well. I can certainly see, teams having data migration related manifests where, based on how complex and how big the data migration plan is, there will be tasks in the data migration plan that are about importing data in the system. So that can certainly be taken out and automated using the task automation here, and it can be in its own manifest. So that way teams know what tasks to perform, which is just automated once, and you can just run it over and over again. So now let me quickly load the data project, for example. So now all the tasks have been loaded from the manifest. And these are all the columns that you see here are the attributes and the elements from the manifest itself. Now going forward on the manifest discussion, this is where the manifest can be also loaded from within the build itself. And this is where the AOT resource concept comes into play. So now here, I only have 3 manifests that are checked into my build. So which is why I am seeing only these 3 manifests. So this is another way to load the manifest, which the way we are seeing this will be the most primary way to load manifests, as it provides a good process from an ALM perspective. Now somebody can download a manifest also. Again, this download is for the manifest that is there in the build itself. And this is how you will be able to download the manifest that we ship as part of platform update very soon. So the key test cases that we want to ship will be in this mechanism, where you can either quickly load the manifest that we ship and run the tests just to assess the quality of data management. At the same time, you can also download the manifest just to get a quick ready sample, and you can change that to your requirements. That way you get a head start onto the manifest itself. So now we have loaded the manifest about data configuration, meaning if I run this, it will only create the data project. It will not actually do the import of data, because that is what I want this to do. Before I run that, this is a clean environment. There are no data projects yet. And the other key aspect is I am in the DAT company, meaning I can select all and I can run the task. And even if this was an import related task, and I want to import data in different companies like HQUS, PICH, and PIFB, as a user, I really don't have to switch companies, which today we have to, because you have to be in the correct company to import the data in that company. But the task automation takes legal entity as an element in the manifest, and it uses that information to know which company it has to import data in. Hence, this is another improvement to the overall process, where you don't have to babysit the demo data import, for example. You can just select all and start run task, and then it'll take a couple of hours to import all the data. You can come back and data is there in all the companies, right? Now, if you had 30, 40 companies, for example, then this becomes quite handy in terms of not having to deal with 40 companies by switching one at a time. So I'll just run the first one for now in sakes of time. And when I say run task, So it's asking me to authenticate access to LCS because the data packages are in LCS. So it's telling, click here to connect to LCS. So the authentication is successful. So now I can go back and I can say, okay. So it's started to execute. So basically behind the scene, it is talking to LCS. It knows which asset library, which asset type, and which asset it needs to download. It is downloading that. And then I'm sure by now it would have started to create. Yeah, the data project has been created and it is actually loading the data package into this data project. So we can quickly check this after a minute once it is completed. But basically, that is what is happening right now. Now, the other thing I wanted to call out is this dialog that you see here is an indication that this is a blocking call, meaning this, so behind the scene, this is using the sys operations framework, which means that you can run your tasks for hours and hours at the same time without having to worry about the session timeout issues. So the reason this is important definitely is from a testability perspective where, it will be possible to run scenarios overnight and then come back in the morning and to see the results, right? So even if data migration, for example, certain data takes about, 3 hours, 4 hours of import. So if somebody was going to automate that using this, the session timeout is no longer going to be a problem. And you can just keep on running it. So that is what is happening here right now. If I want to cancel, I can always cancel. So that specific task will be canceled, and then I can come back and start the next task, for example. But basically, it will keep on going one after the other. So now this is completed. And if I refresh, it says the status is completed and the result is passed. And I can go here. And if I quickly refresh, so it only created the data project. It did not create any execution job because that is what we wanted it to do. And now if I load the project, so it has the demo data shared setup package all loaded. All the entities are here. And I did not have any specific configuration for the entities, but if I had it, it would have gone and configured all of those as well. So it becomes quite easy to manage the configuration now using this automation capabilities. So I can close this here. And coming back here. So now I can select another one and I can run it, or I can do select all, I can run everything. Now about validations. So this is where somebody can go and check the validations. So this was a configuration project only. So there was no data that was imported and hence there is nothing here. But if the data was imported, then the different validations will show up here as to whether it passed or failed. And as we keep on adding more validations, this list will, it will continue to grow. And this becomes a quick way for somebody to validate if the data came in correctly or not. Right? So that's what I was talking about in the presentation. So I think that's what I had to present and demo today. So I'll stop now. And Janice, we can open up for Q&A.
All right, thank you, Sunil. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be starting our Q&A portion here in just a moment, but before we do have one polling question that we'd like to ask. I'm going to go ahead and bring that up on your screen right now. It should appear on the left-hand side of your screen. It says, would you like Microsoft to share test cases for data management via this new automation framework to allow you to validate the platform updates for data management functionality? Go ahead and give a couple moments for people to make their selections. And in one moment, if you said yes, we're going to have you leave your contact details. So be sure to hang out while we do that. It's going to be just a couple more moments while people read through that question and make their selections. All right. right, getting great participation. Thank you so very much. Just a couple more moments. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next portion. If you had answered yes to that question, go ahead and leave your contact details in that white text box and click submit. And while we're going to go ahead and leave that up there for you while we start Q&A. So Sunil, we have a couple questions here. The first question is, what is the use of fail on execution unit level sequence?
So the use case there is you can actually manage the configuration of that in the context of a data package. So you don't have to go and change that again and again from the UI itself. So you can just manage that from the manifest level as part of configuration management. And second, you can then extend that from a testing perspective also, where you can, if you would like to test if that settings actually work or not.
Great. Our next question is the framework publicly available? What is the minimum D365 version that it supports?
So this is another data management functionality, right? So this is nothing different from any other Dynamics 365 for operations features, right? So this is part of the product, and it will be public. It will be available starting PU 16. So if you are part of the early access program, then yes, you will certainly get access to this also, because this is just part of the standard product.
Great. And our next question is, are all possible elements of possible manifests described somewhere in a guide or manual?
Yes, so we are in the process of authoring a wiki. So it will be published once PU 16 is available. So that will, you can look at that as the manifest Bible that will define each and every element and why it should be used and how it should be used. And we also will have best practices defined for creating a manifest and managing a manifest as well. Great.
And our last question here that we have in the queue is, can this task automation be triggered from VSTS build?
That is a great question. The short answer is not currently, but that is definitely we want to enable, because we can certainly see that even from an internal perspective and even from our partner and implementation teams, having a command line interface to this will be super useful, as we can then integrate with the build process. So definitely yes, we will do that, but in the first version that is not available.
Okay, and we had one more question pop in here. Could you clarify where the task automation sits in comparison of PDP?
Another good question. So like I was trying to clarify and bring the differentiation during the presentation, I think if implementation teams have requirements around using PDPs, which basically means you would like to manage data by business process and having that mapping, then LCS is certainly the way to go forward and continue to use that functionality. But if implementation teams just want to manage data packages and import data packages, then this is another solution based on, again, this is all need-based. So what makes it easy for implementation teams, they should use those tools. We are just looking at giving options, and based on the requirements, you can go ahead and choose which tool to use.
All right, we had another one pop in. People keep popping them in, so we still have a couple minutes left, folks. If you have questions, be sure to to pop them in here and we'll get to them. The next one is, would you recommend using the framework or LCS for go live scenarios?
I would, depending on the requirements, right? So for example, if you are looking at configuration management, then definitely yes, you should use this capability. If you are looking at validations, which we will, we will make it part of the go live checklist, and we are going to make it part of the methodology as well, then this is the way to go in terms of validation of scenarios, just to make sure that a quick sanity check has been done before we go live. So certainly this is the way to go in terms of validations and in terms of configuration management.
We're looking for a way to test import and export composite entities, preferably by unit, part of the VSTS build. Can this help in that as well?
It can certainly help once we have the command line interface that can be hooked up with the build process in VSTS. So once that is available, you will certainly can, and that is the only reason why we will enable it, because there is so much value in integrating this with the build process as well.
All right, next one. Can you clarify how the framework helps with the story of data validation / testing for data corruption, for example, after an upgrade?
So if I understood the question, so the key piece here to understand is the import has to happen through the automation framework that we just saw, right? So when you say upgrade, if it was a data upgrade, then it has happened offline, if you will, right? So at that point, the automation framework cannot come into play to figure out if everything happened correctly or not. Second scenario is if you had hand created the data projects and you had manually imported, as you are probably doing today, then there is no way for telling the automation manager that, hey, go and look at this data project and then inspect that data project and come back and tell me if everything passed or failed. Now, that is a good idea. If I were to genericize that, any validations that we are building on this automation platform, it should be available on regular data projects also. That brings a whole next level of flexibility where even existing data projects can leverage this capability. But we are not there yet. So the short answer to your question is, when you talk about strict data upgrade, then no, this cannot be used to validate data from a data upgrade process.
Okay, and next question, is there a way to modify the data packages before import like we do with PDP?
That has to be outside. The automation manager and the automation framework does not provide any capabilities, nor should it provide any capabilities for manipulating data packages. That has to happen outside, and once the data packages are ready, then that can come in.
All right, and that was our last question that we have in the queue. I'm going to take a moment here. We do have a couple more minutes left, so if you guys have any questions out there that you'd still like to ask, make sure to pop those into the Q&A panel. We'll be sure to address them. In the meantime, while we wait for those to come in, I would like to take a moment and bring your attention to a link that I posted in the messages panel. That's a link to a short survey for this web conference, and we ask that you please take a moment before logging out to access it. We hope that you found today's information helpful, and if you enjoyed today's web conference or have feedback on how we can provide you with a better event, this is your chance to let us know. The survey scores are on a scale from 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest score possible. And we did have one more question pop in, and it is, will the storage of the data packages be moved from ICS to VSTS in the future?
Again, a very good question. Something that we have talked about to definitely make the build automation quite nifty and quite flexible. So yes, we definitely want to look into that aspect as well, but right now it is not there.
All right, and that's all the questions we have in the queue right now. Sunil, do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Just wanted to thank everyone to take the time and spend the time with us to learn about this new capabilities. We are excited to have this capability, and we are certainly looking forward for all of you to use and give feedback. And again, thanks for all the feedback on the Yammer group. I enjoy discussing things with all of you there. So please leave your comments and let's continue the discussion on the Yammer group. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Sunil. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that is going to conclude today's web conference. Attendees can access the web conference recording via the same registration link used to attend today's live broadcast. I'd like to extend a big thank you to our presenter, Sunil, and thank you, audience, for logging in and joining us today.